probably run here too long.
Good evening and welcome to the Monday, June 6th, Maplewood City Council Manager Workshop. City Manager Coleman, would you do the roll call for us, please?
Certainly. Councilmember Cave?
Here.
Councilmember Villavicencio?
Here.
Councilmember Lee?
Present.
Mayor Abrams?
I am here as well. Is there a motion to approve our agenda tonight?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Lee, seconded by Cave. The motion to approve the agenda. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. We have no unfinished business. Our new business tonight, community development discussion. Let's see, Ms. Parr, this is your presentation for tonight. I'll turn it over to you.
You know, I'm actually going to pass the ball over to Michael Martin, if you don't mind, Madam Mayor, members of the council. We, with much appreciation to Michael and to Elizabeth Hammond, one of our planners, and Rita Trapp from HKGI, they've been working on this along with a couple of our boards and our planning commission, and we're just going to jump right into it.
Yeah, and Mayor and Council, I'll just add that, yeah, we've been looking with the Planning Commission and a couple of the items also with the Design Review Board for all of last year and all of this year. So for the last year and a half, 2 years, we've been working on some potential updates to the development code. So everything that you've seen has been reviewed and commented on and shaped by the Design Board and Planning Commission. We're looking to get your input tonight, and then we'd actually go back to the Planning Commission to hold the formal public hearing before bringing it back to council for adoption. So with that, I'd ask for the council to call on Ms. Trapp from HKGI to present.
Ms. Trapp, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in front of you again. I haven't seen many of you for a while. I need my presentation. There we go. All right. So before you, I just wanted to provide an overview of what we've been working on for the past couple of years. I'm happy to dive in. I have my computer in case you ask really specific questions because they're probably not in the PowerPoint. But otherwise, I can provide you a pretty good overview and happy to dive in wherever you want to. The topics that we're going to cover include the purpose statements, use tables, specific standards, parking, the R3 district, which is your high density district, signage, and then a little preview to the mixed use district. Relative to the district purpose statements, we did a review of the code and we actually found that there's not a purpose statement for many of the districts. We recommend that one includes that. It is particularly helpful if you're going to evaluate whether there's a rezoning, whether or not that district is the appropriate zoning district for a particular property, or if you're trying to decide if a use is appropriate, that purpose statement is really helpful. So we reviewed all the existing purpose statements, made a couple of revisions. Most of yours we didn't make a lot of revisions to, but we did address new ones, and I think there was 11 districts, if I remember correctly, that didn't have purpose statements. So you'll see part of the revision will have new purpose statements. Relative to the use table, one element of your code, which is very traditional for a zoning code that's been around for a number of years, is that each district had a list of uses, a list of permitted, conditional uses. Oftentimes the districts were organized so that if you were in one district, you wanted to understand what uses were allowed, you actually had to go back one or maybe two districts to figure out if it was in a different district. So one element that we're doing in all of our zoning code updates is creating a use table. We actually started that in a way for the Planning Commission staff to review whether uses were appropriate or not. In discussion with the Planning Commission, they felt that it would actually be a good addition to the code. So we've actually reorganized the code so that the use tables will exist. It's kind of their own standalone table. And then it's an easier way of going through. And I also give you just an example on the next slide. It's obviously just a piece of the puzzle. But that's what they would, something similar to this is what it would look like, where you'd have across the top all of the districts, and then on the side, on the left side, is all of the uses. They're organized by topics, so commercial is together, residential is together, and that's an easier way for people to move through and understand what uses are allowed in each district. We also added different terminology, slightly different than you had today. Currently, you have permitted and conditional, and then accessory. One element is that you had conditions in a variety of places of the code. And so one element that we're doing is in the code table, you'll be able to see where there are conditions or standards that you would have to meet. We signify that by the term PS. So if a use meets specific conditions or standards, I should say, that you've already identified, they would just be allowed administratively. The Planning Commission, Community Design Review Board, City Council would not need to see those. So you can see an example of a PS. kind of in the table. Otherwise, we've retained the traditional conditional use permit that you've used before. That's one of the things we extensively reviewed with the Planning Commission and staff. So we prepared a table, all the red marks are where we're making some adjustments, and the Planning Commission took a deep dive into every piece of the table to make sure that what we were doing made sense. So that's part of the process. You also historically had a few uses that were listed as prohibited, and that's a confusing element and actually sets you up for a little bit of a problem, so that if you have uses that are specifically listed as prohibited, but yet there are actually other prohibited uses, then you have a conflict, because then it implies that only those two uses, for example, are prohibited, and anything else is something that would need to be addressed. So we've eliminated that by taking out any mention of prohibited uses, other than saying if it's not in the table, it is a prohibited use. That provides more clarity and a little bit more legal recourse for you, in the fact that if someone wants to do something that's not in the table, they actually have to go through a process. That's a public process to make sure that you're okay, and the Planning Commission is okay that a use is allowed that isn't specifically described. We also cleaned up the definitions. We tried to make fewer uses a little bit more encompassing, to try and make things a little bit easier. As I referenced, you currently have standards in a variety of places. Sometimes they're in the district, sometimes they're embedded with a list of uses. So it says this is allowed as long as, oh, sorry. Yeah? Okay. So we consolidated all of those into what we're calling a use-specific standards section. So if you would open up this section of the code, anything that had a standard that you needed to meet, whether it was conditional or permitted with standards, it's all in the same place. It's alphabetized. We removed issues where there was some conditions for some districts, some for another. So that's all together now, and that makes it easier for folks, as well as for you and for staff, so that you don't miss something. One element that we wanted to flag specifically for discussion, or just to make sure that we're on the right track, is accessory dwelling units. Currently, the current term is secondary dwellings. It's not a really modern term. Traditionally now, people call it accessory dwelling units. I have the proposed definition. You didn't have a definition in your code. So we added a definition, which is a self-contained dwelling unit with a separate entrance, kitchen, sleeping area, and full bathroom facilities, which is located within, attached to, or on the same lot as an existing residential dwelling. Currently, it was only allowed in the mixed-use district. The Planning Commission discussed and recommended that we also explore allowing it in some of the residential districts. So you can see in the RE, the R1 districts, and the R2 districts. That's similar to other communities. However, that's something we wanted to flag because it is different than you currently have, significantly different. So we wanted to flag that to make sure it was okay. There are specific standards that are recommended, and I'm not going to read them all, but these are the kinds of standards that we see when we work with communities on accessory dwelling units. So these are things like making sure that they're only a certain size, the idea that they're smaller than the principal dwelling, those types of elements. And I can certainly pause and answer questions, since it is an item that we're flagging. And if there's concerns, this is why we're here, to find out what concerns
I see
you have.
Councilmember Cave has a question.
Hi, thank you.
Yes.
The secondary dwellings, is that also something like a mother-in-law apartment? Or does it have to have a separate entrance completely, or can it be an entrance to the house?
So that is something that the city can decide how they want to term it. If you would have something that has to be only accessed through the house, then in some communities, we don't actually flag those as accessory dwelling units because they're connected within the principal structure. Mm-hmm. Usually, accessory dwelling unit means something that has its own complete separate entrance.
Okay.
And if you want to limit it, then we want to look at it a little bit differently. And every community looks at it slightly differently, so that's why we wanted to flag that for conversation.
Thank you.
Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mayor. Interesting, because one of my neighbors talked to me about this just last week. So my question is, in point F, item number 1 here, the square footage of the detached ADU shall be counted towards the total allowable accessory structure area on a lot as listed in individual zoning district. I know there's like certain, so take into consideration you can only have so many buildings on your lot. Is this something that we can, that would not be considered counted towards that? What's common practice for that piece?
Common practice and what we deal with is when people are going to put an accessory dwelling unit in a detached structure. So oftentimes a garage doesn't work, but think of it as a garage conversion or a shed or something. Most communities I work with, they actually count that towards either the number of accessory structures or the square footages, because you don't want to end up overwhelming the site. And so usually, that's why we have that, usually we do see it counted, so that if you have a garage, a detached garage, and an accessory dwelling unit, you have to make sure to keep it under a certain size so that you don't have more accessory structure space than your principal structure. But communities can do it differently, but that is historically what we see with most communities, is that they don't want an accessory dwelling unit to be on top of garage space or shed space or workshop space.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Any concerns that you want to flag that we should discuss with the planning commission? I assume since not, but I want to make sure. No? Yes?
Okay. City Manager Coleman.
Rita, I think I read this, but if I didn't, correct me. I thought I saw that it has to have a rental license permit.
I think we
Was
have
that
that in
just
there.
if-
If we don't, we can add that.
I just wanted some clarification. So if you're just doing it for your stepmom or your mother-in-law or whatever, that wouldn't require a rental license. But if you were renting it out as a VRBO or something, then it would. Is that kind of the
Worded as the
practice?
property owner shall comply with the residential rental code.
Okay.
So that would be a clarification with staff on how that's worded. I assume what you said is correct, but
Okay.
that's where I have to defer to staff.
Yeah, Mayor and Council, anytime a unit of housing is rented to a family member, immediate family member, then the rental license is exempt. Any other situation, whether it's short-term, long-term, would then require a rental license.
Thank you.
Which causes me to have a question. Since we're talking about how everything works together, I really appreciate the fact that we are doing this. 40 years is a long time to hold on to these standards and not revisit them. So it is time. Lots of things have changed. Sometimes when we make changes in one part of an ordinance, it can impact other parts of an ordinance. And so I appreciate your comments, and you know, there would be a concern about overwhelming a site. That would be a concern for me. I just want to make sure too that, you know, we are very conscious of protected wetlands. And so that whatever we may do in updating these standards, that it still works well together, that, you know, we're not doing anything to change our protected wetlands. It's not going to expand that so that we can put more units on a site. So I just want to make sure that we are looking at some of those other ordinances that may be touched by this particular update. And I know that that's maybe something for staff and for the Planning Commission to make sure that all of that is going to work together well, because sometimes, like I said, we want external consistency, but we also want internal consistency with our other ordinances. Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mayor. Just doing some more thinking about not overwhelming lots or something like that. Can we take into consideration if your lot is a certain size that this would not count towards the maximum that you can have? Is that something that can be taken into consideration? Because I see this as a living unit facility versus like a garage or a shed or something like that. So that's why I'm thinking about the possibilities of looking at that as not counting towards it.
We can certainly revisit that and provide some more information to the Planning Commission about what the impact of that would be. Certainly, it can be done that way. And there may be other standards in the code that help not make sure that you're overwhelming the lot. You know, for example, depending on how everything's written, they have to meet other standards that may also help. So we can bring that back to the Planning Commission and have them rethink about that and then make a recommendation to you. And then obviously, when we come back through, we would flag that as something you had mentioned today, and that we want to make sure you heard what the Planning Commission said, and then you can decide for yourselves if you want to change it or stay the course of whatever the recommendation was.
I think that sounds like a good plan. I really like it that our Planning Commission is going to review this first. So, thank you.
Any other?
No, not any other questions right now.
Okay, great. So that was the high level on the use table. Certainly, there's a lot to dive into, but we want to make sure to cover everything. So one other element that we focused on for this year was the R3 Residence District, which is the multiple dwelling district. We reorganized it. Currently, it was there was a lot of different elements that kind of were repeated and were in different spots. So that got reorganized. The definitions are at the beginning. Anything that applies to all of the R3s is all in the common place at the beginning of the chapter, and then after that is when we distinguish between R3A, R3B, and R3C. One inconsistency that was found is double dwellings is something that was allowed, but it wasn't really clear how it was allowed. And that's not really the intention of that district, so we're just adding a clarification that if you want to have a double dwelling or like a twin home, you can do it as part of a townhouse project, but these districts are really intended for your townhouses, apartment complexes, not necessarily for duplexes or twin homes. So that's just a clarification that we made. We also wanted to note clarification. Currently, the code requires 35% of the site be retained for and devoted to green space. However, there was no definition of what green space was, so we added the definition so that we could be clear about that. We wanted to flag it for you in case the definition that we drafted, the Planning Commission revised, didn't meet what you were envisioning for green space, so we wanted to make sure to call that out. Basically, the idea is what's not covered by paved surfaces, principal structures, anything like a deck, pergola, things that you can use for passive or open space on a lot or in a development. So if that works, that's kind of what we were proposing. That didn't exist in the code, and you've been doing fine without it, but it never hurts to clarify so that it's easier for everybody when you're reviewing a development proposal. Another big element that we talked about was off-street parking, and I know when we worked on the North End District, parking was a big conversation then as well. So I'm going to do a little bit of background, probably spend a little bit more on this than kind of the other topics. Parking was reorganized and simplified. We tried to add some clarity, some introductory provisions, things like making sure that once you have a parking area, you can't reduce the number that are in there from any future development, requiring off-site facilities if you allow them to be part of an agreement or an easement or something, so that as ownership changes in the future, if you allowed a shared parking agreement, they can't change ownership and then it's no longer there and it's not serving its purpose. Establishing some standards for shared parking facilities, clarifying how parking is determined if it's not listed in the table. It was a little unclear, so making sure that we understand how parking will be determined. So if a use is similar but it's not in the table, there's a process by which you would identify how many parking spaces are required. There were some recommendations regarding minimum parking standards, and the changes were noted in your packet. I wasn't going to necessarily walk through them. Hopefully you had a chance to take a look at those. Those are the specific ones that we ended up with. We had made some other recommendations, and the Planning Commission gave us guidance on where they thought some changes were reasonable. So, for example, manufacturing and warehousing, we kind of dropped those numbers required, kind of based on everybody's experience. They felt comfortable. They didn't feel comfortable making some changes about residential, so those have stayed the same. So those are some things we explored with the Planning Commission. Just a really kind of reminder on why parking is so important and why we spent some time. As you know, it consumes land. This is not a picture from Maplewood. This is actually a picture from Shoreview, but it does such a great job, so I always like to use it. So that's the target on Lexington. Historically, on the left, they had an empty pad states that was parking, as you can see. It probably never got used, and so they were able to, at a later date, kind of fill it in with a fast casual restaurant. I don't like saying fast food. It's probably a fast casual restaurant. So that's why parking is important, is sometimes we can use things that we've historically used as parking for other purposes and kind of enhance the area around it. It does affect affordability. The cost of parking, as you all know from all the work you do, is expensive, especially when you're looking at underground parking, surface parking. The impacts aren't just related to affordability. It obviously impacts the environment, and Maplewood is well known for its interest in sustainability. So it affects the environment. The more you have as parking, the more we need to manage as stormwater. So that's why we went through the effort to try and improve the parking standards, really look at the minimums. And I know we did that with the North End too, with the idea if there's transit around, then maybe we can look at parking in a slightly different way. It also causes conflict. If we don't have enough, then the neighbors are obviously impacted, and we don't want to do that also. We don't want to impact neighbors unnecessarily. So that's why parking is important and something that we spent some time on. There's also the perception versus reality, and given the fact that we have a regional mall here, everybody knows the perception versus reality element of what we thought we needed when we built it and what's the reality of how much it actually gets used. So those are some things. Hopefully, the changes we made about those parking numbers make sense. Certainly, if there was areas that you wanted to look at more, we could certainly revisit those. As I said, we did look at some other areas that the Planning Commission just felt like the changes from COVID and the changes of kind of how COVID impacted things meant that we weren't quite ready to make some other adjustments. Certainly something we could look at again if necessary. Any
know that-
questions on parking?
You know, I know that parking is very important. If I could categorize a number of the calls and emails that I get, it has to do with parking. It has to do with overnight parking, too many cars at specific locations, and this perception and reality comes into play. So I think parking is very important, and we need to take a look at it. And especially if we're looking at, you know, adding the potential of adding new units. Parking in our neighborhoods is going to be incredibly important, where, you know, in many places we have, you know, on the one hand, we are in some places narrowing streets, which is reducing parking, and that creates friction in neighborhoods. And so I think we really need to be very intentional and mindful about it and look at what the potential impact is with any kind of changes that we make with parking. So, thanks. Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mayor. I have two questions, actually. So looking at the recommendations that you've made here, the proposed, are these based on any specific study, numbers, nationwide, or anything like that at all?
They're not based on a specific study. Unfortunately, in the world, there's not like a magic book that we can go to. There is a guide to parking, but it is something that's a national guide, and so we always use that as part of the information that we use, but we also use local information. So for example, we would look at what the Institute for Transportation Engineers recommends, and then we would also look at what does surrounding cities recommend. We also would meet with staff on certain uses and say, what are you seeing in the reality? I know when we had COVID, we actually did some counts because everybody was home. So it was a nice time to do residential counts, and that kind of informed us at that time that things were actually fairly close to what we thought we needed. So a combination of factors goes into the recommendations.
Thank you. Just a second question here is, there's one space for every 500 square footage of gross indoor display area for automobiles, sales, leasing, and rental. And we have a huge automobile sales economy here in our city. Has there been conversations with some of those folks? Is that sufficient? Is it too much, too little?
So I don't think we have had conversation with folks specifically. In terms of, this is the minimum requirement, so everybody is always able to build more, other than in the north end when we do have a cap on a few things. But otherwise, in the rest of the community, you can build more if you need it. That's certainly a conversation that could be had. But I think if I remember correctly, currently, there isn't a standard for that at all. Am I right? Right. So this is the first time you'll have a standard for it. So that is something that we could let folks know if you have a concern about that and see if they have. But I know that it would just be a minimum. They can always have more space if they want it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other parking related? Because I'm going to switch topics on us. All right, signage. So signage was important to address because there was actually case law, federal case law that impacts signage. It was back in 2016, actually. And that federal case law said that cities cannot regulate signs based on the content of the sign. So the easiest way to think about it is if you have to read the sign to figure out what kind of sign it is, then your regulations aren't going to work because you have to base it just on the size of the sign, the type of business that it is, the district it is in. So you can't, so for example, a garage sale sign, a real estate sign, you have to actually see that the sign says for sale to know that it's a real estate sign. So all of that had to go, which means your sign code needed to go through a huge overhaul. It also made things a little bit challenging because you have a lot of signs that were broken up by type. And so trying to make sure that we're not taking away what you were allowing in the past, but making it still usable was a nice balancing act. One thing we did try and do is reorganize so the same types of signs are together. So temporary signs, exempt signs, permanent signs, all their regulations are in the same section. It used to be organized a little differently where you had to kind of know what district you were in, and then you had to know what kind of sign you wanted. And it worked well for content-based signs, but once content goes away, you have to kind of reorganize it to make it make sense. We also removed some redundancies, improved some consistency in terminology. So types of signs, this is where the fun pictures come. These are all the different types of signs that are included, and these are the terminologies. So as you can see, they're not based on the content, they're based on the structure of the sign. An awning sign, a monument sign, a pylon sign. These will be included in your code. They're specifically designed for your code, so they'll go in the definitions of signs so people can clearly see what type of sign it is. Banner signs, window signs, property identification signs, all of those are types of signs. Changeable copy, keeps going, dynamic signs, so all of those are things we have to regulate in different ways. We are included one new proposed type of sign, the ground banner sign. That's an example of what they look like. They're kind of a newer in the industry. They kind of replaced, I'm not going to do the dance like I did for the Planning Commission. They replaced the guy that dances. Held myself back a little. Or the kind of the banner signs, they're a new type. And so you didn't have any regulations. Through conversation with the Planning Commission, we're recommending that you can have one every 150 linear feet of frontage so they don't become overwhelming. You probably, because you don't have regulations, you probably can think of examples where someone had more than one of these. So if that's not a good number, we should adjust the number, but it was a starting point for discussion. And there's differences based on the type of district it is in. So that's a totally new sign. It's considered a temporary sign. You can only have it up for 60 days, and then it should be removed. Dinah?
I have a question about that, because I think White Bear Avenue is pretty notorious for banner signs, and, the removal after 60 days, does that mean you remove it after 60 days, and then you wait one day, and then you can have another 60 days? And then my question is, how are we going to really manage that and enforce that? Because I know that banner signs, they're kind of like in, and a lot of people really like them, and I think now that the weather gets better, you see an awful lot more of them. So I guess I have some concerns about that. What does that mean? You only get 60 days in a year? Is that what that means? Or,
Just a second. I'm reading to make sure I get it correctly.
okay.
The way we have right now, which we can always change, which is why we're having these conversations, it is 60 days per year. And signage is one of the most challenging things to administer. You all know that. It is typically it's complaint-based, or unless someone sees something that's really egregious. Otherwise, it does take staff time. So it is important to get these regulations correct, because it will take staff enforcement in order for it to happen. If you are willing to have them, we have other temporary signs that say X number of days, 4 times a year. We can certainly look at that language. Since it's new, we need to kind of figure out what works for you in terms of length of time they can be up, and then how many times a year they could be up.
It may be something that we want to pursue a little bit further, because really, what 60 days out of the year do you pick? If you're a business owner, is it summertime? That's kind of challenging. But I certainly don't want to see banner signs as a permanent fixture. I don't think that's appropriate. But how we can restrict that in a reasonable way, and still respect our business owners so that they can use those, because I think that they're certainly effective. They certainly catch your eye. But there's also overload on those, and I think White Bear Avenue is a key example of an overload of those banner signs. I think Councilmember Cave was next.
You know what, you asked the question I was going to ask. So I do like looking at it again and maybe looking at the language for the other temporary signs, because and then also, one other question, after this goes through, then every business will get a notification that if they have this type of sign and everything else, that they can only have it up for so much.
That'll be part of the implementation process and how staff chooses to kind of work through letting people know. Obviously,
Okay.
anything new coming in,
Yeah.
many of the signs, except for certain exempt signs, certain things don't need permits, but those that need permits, as new permits come in, you will let them know. The ones that have permits, you may let them expire, and then the next time you would kind of go in. The
Yeah,
enforcement
yeah,
mechanism,
yeah.
if you want more information about that, maybe when we come back, we can kind of
Okay.
explain.
That would be
what
good. I
staff's
think a
plan is.
rollout, a successful rollout is going to be important so that people know and understand kind of what our ordinances are. Councilmember Villavicencio.
It says 150 feet of the street frontage. And I'm wondering, does that include, like, the drive-through coming into the parking lot?
Typically, yes.
That would include the
Okay.
the driveway into the lot.
Yeah, because that's the part that I've kind of been concerned about as I'm going down Wiper Avenue, is like the cars that pull in, they get really, those signs get really close to the driveways sometimes too, so,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, is that all signs or just those kinds of signs?
I've noticed these ones in particular.
Well, maybe we need to add a statement that talks about setting back from any driveway or sidewalk to make sure that there isn't a potential issue. Great.
And I think, too, that can create visual problems in terms of people turning if they're too close, if you can't see around them.
Right, yes.
And there is a general statement at the beginning that talks about visibility, but it wouldn't hurt if particularly these, if that's something we see as more of an issue, we can certainly add language to remind people because, you know, whether they read those introductory provisions or not. I know. They probably just go down to their particular
Clarity
sign.
helps.
We know that.
It really does.
Great. Any other signage related? I do have two more elements to just briefly talk about. Oops, I went backwards. Dynamic displays. I just wanted to note that currently the code does not address the mixed-use district and the North End district. So it was recommended that the signs, the standards for those signs be modeled after the public institutional uses in residential districts. So using standards you already have, that you already use, recognizing that a mixed-use district will have residential uses, we want to make sure that any dynamic display is not a problem for those residents that may live there. So that was a kind of a gap that happens as you add districts to a code. So that's been addressed, and that's kind of the approach we took for addressing it. And then the other element that's a little bit interesting, just because, again, it goes back to the content neutral, is murals weren't really addressed. It talked about allowing murals, but not wall signs, but then you need to know what's a wall sign and what's a mural. And a mural isn't really a sign because it doesn't have. Anyway, so we have a whole new section on murals. I know you don't really have murals in town, but we need to be thinking about that. Could happen. So there's a new section about murals. They're not a sign. It clarifies that they're not a sign, but it does have specific regulations to make sure that it is appropriate. So things like it needs to be on the side or rear property line. I don't think we want a mural looking facing the street. That's not really the intention. We don't want anything that's moving, that's a safety, that's obscene. So we have a whole section on murals based on kind of other precedents. But the main reason we need to have it is you can't read the content of a sign, which makes it difficult to distinguish between a mural and a wall sign, so we needed something that helped us figure that part out. So that's why it's new and different and not something you had before, but a result. So the last section we just wanted to highlight quickly, mixed use. It's an upcoming focus for the Planning Commission. The mixed-use district has not been significantly reviewed or revised for a number of years. It was only originally developed, I believe, for the Hillcrest neighborhood, and then applied to the Gladstone neighborhood, but it hasn't actually been looked at for a while. This map, which is harder to see, but where the hatches are, is where the mixed use is currently applied. So it's not just Gladstone, it's a few other areas. So we wanted to make sure that it makes sense in the code, or this is where it's applied, I think, in the land use plan, that's where mixed use is, mixed use neighborhood. So we wanted to highlight that. The initial review, I think the standards are pretty appropriate. It's not like mixed use is significantly different than it was when it was developed for Hillcrest. One area of discussion, and I know you haven't had a lot of mixed use projects, but currently the code only allows mixed use to be 35 feet tall, which is only 3 stories. Maybe that's our intention, but this is the time if we want to think about that. Is that what is intended? I know the projects you did process a conditional use permit to allow a slightly taller height. If that's something that you wanted to do, we could look at a 4-story, 5-story building. We can add standards that help protect any adjacent residential. We didn't even want to go down that path, though, if you are comfortable with the way that it is currently operating, where 35 feet is a good cap and you want to do the conditional use permit. Happy to do that, but this is the time to have that conversation. And we wanted to ask if there's anything else that you have concerns on. To us, the North End district is very different than mixed use. And so while that district is good to kind of indicate things to think about, it is very different in density, and you're creating a whole new neighborhood, you're putting streets. This is more about parcels redeveloping in a way that allows mix of uses, so it's a little bit different. So we just wanted to take a moment to ask you
if you have any concerns, if you have interest in looking at mixed use in a different way than it has been in the past, because that's going to be our next charge with the Planning Commission to take a look at.
Thank you. You know, I'm going to ask my fellow council members to weigh in on this. I saw that, you know, that was a question that you would like some clarity from the council, so that when we do come back and review all of this, we're matching up with the intention of the council. So I'm going to start with Councilmember Villavicencio. What are your thoughts concerning the current limit of 35 feet?
Well, I think because if it goes beyond the 35 feet, it does require a conditional use permit, then I think that's appropriate, and I think I'm okay with keeping it the way it is for now.
Okay, Councilmember Lee, what do you think?
Thank you, Mayor. I like 35 feet. I want to have a little bit more control over what's coming in. That way we have control of managing the community that they're going to be building in. I do have a couple questions, though, to maybe take into consideration is, you know, this 35 feet, why was it implemented? How long ago was it implemented? And then, you know, does this keep us a competitive city at 35 feet? So just kind of curious to see what some of the answers may be to those.
Can you, just off the top of your head, I know as I drive around the cities, the metropolitan area, I know that many cities are not, they have exceeded the 35 feet.
That's what I would say. If you ask me off the top of my head with no pulling together examples, is that typically a mixed-use district would be higher than 35 feet. That said, there would usually be some standards that help to offset. So if it's like adjacent to a residential structure, it's 2 stories next to the residential neighborhood and maybe 3 or 4 stories as you get towards the street, those kinds of things. But it feels more common in the Twin Cities for mixed-use districts to go a little higher. That said, your conditional use process does allow that to happen. It just involves more effort. So it depends what you want to communicate out to the community about what you're looking for.
And what is why is it that cities have extended that? You know, and I'm not talking about Minneapolis and St. Paul.
No, I know.
I'm talking about,
them as well.
suburbs, just simply driving around and looking at suburbs.
Right.
Why is it that we see taller buildings? Can you kind of give us some background on that?
It's the economics. If you're going to go through the development process, particularly redevelopment, the reality is it costs money to take down the existing buildings, prepare the site, and so economically, it makes the numbers work better to have a little bit taller site. It also can help provide a little more flexibility. So if you want more green space or you want more parking, by able to go taller, it allows the site to be used for other things. If you keep it low and you need those units, it's just trying to make the mechanics of the site work. Again, it's totally city to city what is the vision you have for your city. But yes, it is something that we look at, is looking at higher. Now, I don't think we're working in St. Louis Park, totally different city. So when we're talking to them and we're talking about the height of residential buildings, we're starting to talk about, yeah, it used to be 3, then it was 4, and now I think we're at like a high rise isn't until 7, and every city is different in how you evolve. And so that's why it's worth to have this conversation and see if you've evolved to the point that maybe slightly higher is worth looking at to make it a little bit more productive. And I think if I'm correct, the 2 projects you did have went up 1 extra story, correct?
Yeah, our mayor and council, so there's a handful of projects in different stages of in the Gladstone neighborhood, and yeah, they've had a couple of those projects have been above the 3-story. And in Maplewood, at least, the history of 35 feet, that's been in place citywide for decades. And again, it's not been prohibiting anything above 35 feet. It just kicks in the conditional use permit.
Sure.
For review.
It's interesting because just in looking at our neighboring cities, White Bear, I see now they're building higher than 35, as is North St. Paul. So I think it's certainly worth a discussion, a further discussion about it. I want Councilmember Cave to weigh in on this as well. What are your thoughts?
At this time, I think, talking about it later is a good idea too, but I think staying at 35 and us exercising the CUP is what I think is where we should stay. I do see the projects that we've had people come up, and then it was up to us to see what they were going to do, how they were going to change it, and everybody kind of worked with that, with the redevelopment, so I like the idea of keeping it as it is for now.
Okay.
We can provide more information, as you said, about neighboring cities, and then the Planning Commission can weigh in, and you can weigh in the end.
Yeah.
It's just
I think that would be helpful to have that discussion, certainly. Councilmember Lee, do you have another question?
Yes, just another quick statement. We're a very green, environmental friendly city. We'd like to understand what the height impact is to the environment too, if we were to up it a little bit.
We will address those as we move through the process. Any other comments on mixed use? We focused on height. Any other concerns, thoughts about mixed use or things that you want to make sure we address or answer for you?
I don't see any other lights on.
Awesome. Okay, I think next steps, we're going to prepare the draft mixed-use district for planning commission consideration. It'll be its first time through. They haven't spent any time on it, so we'll use your input to kind of influence that discussion. And then we're going to prepare a draft ordinance with all the amendments. That'll be a repeal and replace because we've just made so many changes that it's better to repeal everything, replace it. The planning commission will need to do their public hearing process, and then it'll be presented to you for consideration. The timing is a little bit, we're still working through that timing. If we do mixed use with everything else, we do everything else. We've been working on this for a couple of years and haven't kind of pulled everything together, so we'll figure out with staff what the timing is. But it's a pleasure to talk with you today, make sure that we're checking in, we're headed the right direction, which is always our goal.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Councilmember Villavicencio.
Sorry, I forgot I did have a question. Did you mention on the signs anything about lights?
There is some elements, which, are we talking about in general or dynamic displays? Because I want to
Well,
make sure.
I guess both is,
Okay.
I'm interested in knowing about both.
Okay. There are some general statements about lighting. They're not particular, the things about not being bothersome to other folks. We are looking at trying to figure out the timing of the change, like how fast a dynamic display can change.
Yes, the
Because that
flashing.
can be distracting. We did a little bit of precedent research. It was amazing to see the wide varieties of numbers. Of how fast that is, so that's something that we'll bring back to the Planning Commission. Otherwise, lighting, there's some elements about neon and things like that, but if there's a specific concern, we can make sure that we're covering it in the lighting part of signage.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like exactly what you just said, the speed in which like it might flash, and that could include the digital displays and any non-digital that have lights.
Okay, I will make sure. My gut is that I don't think there's flashing in non-dynamic displays, but that's just off the top of my head, so I'll make sure that we address it if there is.
And just another internal, external consistency kind of thing. I know that we have regulations on lighting at our businesses in terms of how they angle down and they don't, they're not disruptive to residential neighborhoods. And so can we make sure too that what we're doing here with our signs fits in with what we're already doing? I know we've had these discussion about Menards and about gas stations and about, how different buildings are lit up at night and when the lights have to be dimmed and all of that, so that we have some real consistency with that. Now's the time, since we're doing this big, redo, to make sure that we have all of those bases covered and we don't have little inconsistencies, because we want to be clear in terms of the message that we're basically the ordinance that we would be approving, and then also so that we can tell our businesses and our residents these are what the ordinance changes are. So thank you for that. Okay. We have no other questions tonight, and this is our only agenda item. So,
Madam Mayor?
oh, wait, yes, we do. I'm sorry. I jumped ahead too quickly.
She's excited. Madam Mayor, members of the council, so we have quite a few items left, and I'm wondering if maybe if I could be so bold as suggest we just take one of those tonight because it's on your regular agenda, and that's the fair housing. We need to get that taken into consideration so that we can open ourselves up to some funding opportunities that are coming, if that would be okay.
That would be perfectly fine. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Had pulled up, that would be great. I'm going to be sort of abbreviated on this, so. It's somewhat of a housekeeping item, but it's important, so I don't want to minimize it by calling it a housekeeping item. The City of Maplewood, as a recipient of the Federal Community Development Funds under Title I of the Housing Community Development Act of 1974, is obligated to certify that it will affirmatively further fair housing within the city's municipal boundary. The template that you saw, the language you saw in your staff reported in the packet, that's largely template language that comes from the Met Council. If you look at all the other communities that have adopted it, and there's a lot in Minnesota, you will find that it's very similar language, the requirements we have to meet, or we can't apply for these different resources. Our 2040 housing section of our comprehensive plan also identifies this as an adopted policy we need to get in place. To be eligible, as I mentioned, for some of the funding sources from the Met Council, from DEED, the Department of Employment and Economic Development, and there are others that reference it from time to time that Michael and I see. We need to have this in place in order to do that. In a nutshell, I guess I will just tell you that it comes down to, was that me? It comes down basically to the policy that makes a commitment on the side of Maplewood to ensure fair and equal housing opportunities, regardless of race, color, religion, gender, sexual orientation, marital status, status with regard to public assistance, familial status, and national origin of disability or disability. We just want to make sure that we are doing all that we can to be in compliance with this. And there are some specific things we need to do in order to make sure that we're complying. When people come in and we are advising them, we want to make sure that there's a referral process in place. We want to make sure that there's meaningful access. When people go online, that there's actually a resource page in multiple languages, or they can show up in person, and we can provide that to them as well. Some of these things somewhat exist if someone were to reach out to us, but this is a much more proactive, very concrete way of things we do need to put in place in order to make sure we're in compliance. And they're just good practices that we should be doing, and I think we all would agree on that. Some of the internal things we need to do are some staff training. Some we have done, but we need to do some additional, as well as potentially some officials. Some of our boards and commissions and yourselves may be asked to participate in some of that in the future as well. And analyzing our housing. As part of an item we were going to discuss that I imagine we will discuss in the near future is our housing, future affordable housing ownership program that we're working with the Rondo Community Land Trust on. That housing analysis we want to do as a part of that as well, so we would really get a bonus out of that. Our code analysis that Michael and others are working on in relation to making sure that we're not creating impediments that make it harder for people. In any way, shape, and form in any of those groups. And then project planning analysis, community engagement will be something we'll want to do again in relation to this or do further. And then affirmatively, we want to make sure that we are creating opportunities to further fair housing in Maplewood. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. The actual policy was in your packet, and it's on your consent agenda this evening, but we wanted to give you a little extra time because it's really important, and we just wanted to make sure that we introduced it before just throwing it on the consent agenda. We wanted you to have an opportunity as well.
Thank you for highlighting all of this. This is very important for our community. Is there anything else you want to say about it? I mean, we've got a little extra time.
Wow, now I have all this extra time. What are we going to do with it? we could jump forward into any of the update items if you like and see what we can get covered, if you're good with that. I'm not going to spend any time, or not much, in regard to the Reuter-Walton project because that's coming before you as part of a public hearing and for TIF consideration. So we'll just move right beyond that. I'll turn it over really quick to Michael if you want to talk about the Gladstone House. Michael?
Sure. Mayor and Council, so just an update on where the city stands with 1375 Frost, Gladstone House. The Planning Commission and Community Design Review Board looked at and reviewed the land use requests at their meetings. Just the design board did. It did not require any conditional use permit or any review by the Planning Commission, as it is a 3-story building like we talked with Rita earlier. So it's meeting all those site dimensional requirements. Now, we'll go to the City Council on July 10th. And again, this is just for the land use component for design review and then a parking waiver. And so that site needs a 20-spot parking waiver, but they're also working with the Philippine Center to have 20 to 21 spaces for overflow parking across the street. So a little bit of a wash there in terms of parking. In terms of the financial side, and this relates to what Danette talked about in the fair housing policy, in December, the city was successful in being awarded a $1 million grant from the Met Council to be used towards this project. Items like the fair housing policy need to be in place for the city to receive that grant, and the grant agreement is also on your consent agenda tonight at the regular meeting. And then later in the year, we will expect an application for tax increment financing from Beacon. And with this project and JB Vang projects that we'll talk to in the next slide, you know, with all the changes that happened at the legislature this last session, there's more funding opportunities out there, and with the reclassification of 4D taxes, there might be other funding opportunities, other things to take in mind in addition to TIF, and maybe reduce that reliance on TIF. So we'll be working with the developers, with Ellers, our financial consultant, to provide the best package to move forward with these projects. So I mentioned JB Vang. The phase one has gone through their land use entitlements, so that's gone through the council and received approval for everything they need to move forward on that aspect. They, in the same situation as Beacon, will be applying for tax increment financing. But again, just want to reiterate, we want to make sure we're accounting for all the changes in the state and take advantage of those additional funding opportunities. As JB Vang, this phase one has already received a good amount of different funding from different sources, from the tax credits at Minnesota Housing to funds from Ramsey County. So we want to keep taking advantage of those programs that are out there. And then something that's exciting, they're already looking at a phase two. So they do have an option to purchase the property that's directly south of their site. So that phase one's 1310 Frost, right on the corner of Frost and English. Directly south is 1880 English. Again, letter or an option to purchase that. They've already received a county award of ARPA funds of just over $2.7 million. At the EDA meeting even later tonight, you'll be considering a resolution of support and a letter from the president of the EDA, again, to show support of JB Vang's pursuit of phase two, which would be approximately 50 to 55 units of additional multifamily housing. So just a couple other updates on projects. The senior housing project that was approved by the city council at 1910 County Road C, that's on the vacant land that's to the southwest corner of County Road C and White Bear. The city worked as the lead applicant, partnered with the developer for some cleanup dollars. The Met Council fund, the TBRA fund from the Met Council, the city unfortunately did not advance and did not receive any funding there, but we did receive funds from DEED. We were just notified today, receiving just over $720,000 to be used towards cleanup funds. And then looking at the Rice Street Gardens, the St. Paul Regional Water property, obviously some pre-planning, pre-development work needs to happen there, and the city was successful to land a $150,000 grant. So with all the funds that are out there, the city has had some pretty good success over the last year and a half of bringing these dollars into Maplewood to help further projects along.
Thank you, Michael. I will add one thing to the Rice Street Gardens. There was a board meeting recently, and they made some presentations in regards to awards that the Rice Street Garden group has gotten, and so far they've acquired $600,000 in donations between some foundation gifts as well as individual donors. So just as an update. The Affordable Home Ownership Initiative, as the council may recall, there was a study that was undertaken by Humphrey students at the University of Minnesota. They made some great recommendations, some of those that we are looking at taking into account. We've been working with the Rondo Community Land Trust, and we are looking to utilize some new legislative funding that was just recently announced. 31.1 million was given to Minnesota cities, any that were in the metro area that were over 10,000 in population. As of right now, it's looking like Maplewood will get 428,832, and they're expected that'll go up in 2025. So this would be one potential way to utilize those funds. We'll be coming back when we have a lot more time to chat with the council to see how you want to look at this program, kind of work out some of the options and see what you think is most favorable in regards to affordable home ownership in conjunction with the land trust, so that we can have that be sustainable and long-term, as has previously been the vision for the council. And then talk about how we can utilize those funds as well as others that we have come across as opportunities as well. And then if we have, I'm going to give this in under 2 minutes here. The fire station in Gladstone, it's really important, obviously, in that neighborhood. Now that we have the opportunity to use it in a different way, we will be looking at opportunities in the marketplace, how we can market that, maybe go out for some requests for proposals. The one thing we've sort of been waiting on is to see what happens with the developments in that corridor. It's hard to let people see a vision when they don't see active construction going on. We're almost there, so we're going to be working with our communications department and talking about what could that look like. And our communications department's had some creative ideas about how we could potentially market that site, maybe with a drone or do some other things that could really make it dynamic. So we're going to talk about that a little bit further, and I imagine we'll be back in the not-too-distant future to have those conversations once we see construction kick off in the corridor with a couple projects that you'll be hearing about tonight and some that you've previously approved.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
exciting discussions. I appreciate it. And now, we are concluded with our agenda.
Thank you.
We are adjourned.